Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my office here at home. So I did not receive any emails last week with people asking me any questions to respond to, so I didn't make that second video last week. But again, if you need to, please feel free as you're reading the chapter to send me an email with questions that you want me to answer. Now, if you did send me an email with questions and you're thinking to yourself right now, but I did send an email with questions, by all means, please let me know that, hopefully by sending me a text message because I did not receive it. So again, if you need to, feel free. You don't have to, of course, but feel free to send me emails asking me to explain certain concepts or ideas that are in your book that we don't quite get enough of an explanation of from the book or from these little lectures here, because I don't go extraordinarily in depth the way I might do if we were in a classroom, particularly because you can't ask me questions in real time. So do feel free to do so. So last week, last week, we talked about chapters 1 and 2. We are moving through the book very quickly, as you know, as is the case with a second half semester course. Chapters 3 and 4 introduce us to some new concepts and ideas that most people don't realize are important to the understanding of argument in social situations. Now, my mother likes to say to me all the time, Bethan, do not start that debate crap with me. First of all, she'll never say, a swear word. Her toughest swear word is dim-dum and crap. So she will never use any other wording with me, and she calls me Bethan. She's the only one who's allowed to do that, by the way. Anyway, she says, don't pull that debate crap with me when all I might be doing is asking her reasoning for something. That might sound familiar to some of you because really through I'm going to say the late, younger millennials, and certainly Gen Z, I have seen a lot more reaction to that question of, but why do you think that? That has been a little bit more negative than in the past. Now, why is that? Partially because our culture is changing. And that's what chapter 3 really gets into with you in our reading, is that idea of how our culture has changed that might make us more defensive or might make us question when other people are questioning us for our reasons. Like, some people believe they should be able to just say, that's my opinion. You asked for my opinion. Okay, but I was just wondering what your reasoning was. How did you get to that opinion? How did you get to that conclusion? Because maybe I want to try to follow along, either just to understand your conclusion, or maybe I want to think about something a different way too. So it's not always an attack when somebody says, why do you have that opinion? Why do you think the way that you do? It doesn't necessarily mean they're looking for a reason to be critical or something wrong with the way that you're thinking or what your opinion is. How did we get to that point in our culture where that is seen as an attack? Simply through diversity. And that's not a bad thing, by the way. Perhaps those of us raised by, we were raised mainly by silent generation people, we Gen Xers. Despite what people think, the boomers raised the millennials, not Gen X, and we weren't raised by the boomers. We were raised by the silent generation. So I always say, don't blame us. It's not our fault. We take responsibility for our children who are Gen Z, right? I almost said Gen Z. That would have been awkward. I'm not sure where that came from. But Gen Z, those are the children that we raised. But when we were being raised, you didn't talk back to adults. And sometimes talking back to an adult meant even if they asked you a question, you didn't want to talk back by answering. So sometimes they would ask us, well, what do you think of this? And I'd be like, do you really want to know? Like, are you sincerely asking me? And then we would have to defend that answer. And we got into that. We really learned very quickly that we couldn't just say the answer is blue. We had to say, here's why. Somehow, with the younger millennials moving into Gen Z, we got to this place where all of a sudden it was, that's none of your business. Okay, so I ask you a question. For example, did you guys read the assignment for this week? And let's say that you say no. And I say, why? And you say, that's none of your business. Well, that makes it difficult for me to improve my teaching or to find a way to motivate you to read. I need to know the reasoning behind it, right? And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on, which way you look at it, our increase in diversity has led to an increase in, well, really Gen Xers especially, trying to be more understanding, empathetic, more willing to accept, well, that's just your opinion and that's how it is. However, in school, in academia, in your job, that is not going to fly. You are going to have to explain your answers. It's literally not always going to be a situation where you get to just say, well, my answer is this because I feel that way, and that's the end of it. Now, some of you are probably learning that or have learned that lesson already, and great. How did we get there? Why does argument have such a negative connotation in our culture? Most of the time when we say argument, people think of a disagreement. It doesn't necessarily mean a disagreement. Making an argument simply means making a claim and being able to explain your reasoning for that claim. That's it. Sometimes that's as much as it takes. So argument in culture has a very negative connotation because we always think of it as a conflict. We always think of it as a competition. And that's not really what it is. Thank goodness, right? So your book outlines for you some of the challenges and very differing perspectives on what we mean with that word argument, but not necessarily what we mean by the reasoning that goes behind an argument. Let me give you an explanation. Some people hear argument, and we can explain till we're blue in the face that when we say argument, we don't mean a disagreement. We mean a discussion or a positing of an idea that has reasoning behind it. Let me explain why. Let me tell you why. Why don't you tell me why? How did you come to that conclusion? And so on. Where does that usually happen? Unfortunately, it most often happens in politics. So there is a double whammy about how people feel about simply the word argument, let alone the process of an argument. Hopefully in this book, we're going to be sort of demystifying what that actually means. And this chapter starts to do that because in this chapter, you can know all the reasons for why we have these differing perspectives about the role of argument in our culture. But your book also talks about how to use strategies to sort of overcome those challenges to those differing perspectives. Particularly, your book talks about belongingness and inclusion. And sometimes when people hear diversity, inclusion, belongingness, unify, what they're hearing is differences based on race, age, gender, etc. But what we're really talking about are different perspectives on ways of thinking. That's it. That's all the diversity that we really need to talk about. And what happens when we give our opinion? What happens when we make a claim or an argument, as we talk about in this class? A lot of times that marginalizes others or brings in a different group. It demarcates and lines out or puts boundaries on who is and who is not in our area of perspective or differing perspective or disagreement or agreement. Okay? And so that can be an incredibly big challenge to being able to make a persuasive point, a persuasive argument to our audiences. So we don't need to be cautious about belonging and inclusion because there's some woke reason to do it or whatever the argument is. Sometimes we need to be doing it because that's the only way you persuade. And actually, people who have studied rhetoric since Aristotle, really, they actually were talking about this idea of inclusionary words and invitational rhetoric. Okay, so that's leading us sort of into chapter 4. I apologize. That is chapter 3. Good. I'm on task. That's excellent. But that leads us into chapter 4 a little bit, where we talk about inclusion, right? And we talk about, I'm sorry, my notes just really went wacky for some reason that I don't understand. And of course, I can't see them as well without my glasses on when they are this small. Okay, apologies. I was able to do that for a little bit. So that idea of invitational rhetoric, and what do we mean by that, and why is that important? So let's just say in the public discourse, we're having a disagreement, or I'm making a point. For example, I'll go out of my comfort zone for a second and say, getting rid of the income tax is a really good idea, or getting rid of the income tax is a really bad idea for the state of Missouri. Whichever way I go, I am taking a position, which means that I am taking a side. But there are ways for me to explain those claims in a way that doesn't exclude a whole group of people, or in a way that invites people to come into the conversation. Rather than saying, this is true because I say it's true, we say instead, let me tell you a story, or let me invite you to consider the following facts. Literally, I use the word invite there. Invitational rhetoric or invitational argumentation is not soft. It is instead a way of making a point that doesn't exclude or alienate a group of people, any group of people, half your audience, all of your audience. It is very easy to fall into the trap of saying, okay, I am going to talk about this particular subject and only some of you are going to understand, or only those of us with jobs truly understand, or only those of you with children understand. That kind of language really demarcates and excludes a major portion of your audience. There is no way to persuade when we use exclusionary language, marginalizing language, or when we don't consider how to include everyone in our audience into our conversation. In other words, argument is not about divisive competition or conflict. It's about inviting people to a conversation. All right, so that's chapter 3. Now, again, if you have any questions, I want you to ask. For example, if you want me to dive into standpoint theory, I can do that for you. If what you've read in the book and the text is enough for you, that's fine. But if you want to dive deeper into any of these subject areas, please let me know and we will do so. Yes, that is something I am qualified to talk about. So pretty much anything in this book, yes, I'm qualified to talk about. But that moves us into chapter 4, because at this point we are asked, what is an argument then? If it is true that an argument is not conflictual, a competition, and always about demarcating lines, what exactly is it then? And I want to make sure that I share with you the exact definition in your book, because I don't want to be, what's the word? I don't want to confuse you. So, of course, the book outlines that there are many meanings, of course. We are going to try to get to a single definition of argument. And your book posits the following. It's any situation in which a claim is made, support is offered, and is in the context of a disagreement. So your book actually does say that it's in the context of a disagreement. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that that is a fine definition for argument. It doesn't always have to occur in sort of the environment of a disagreement. Let me explain what I mean by that. You may not be actively engaged in a disagreement, but the claims that you make or the arguments that you're positing may have good argumentation against them, and you know that. So you're making a speech and you put out there that you're positing that getting rid of the income tax is a great idea, and that's all you're talking about, without acknowledging that there is a slew of argumentation for why it's a bad idea to get rid of the income tax. So for me, sometimes that in the context of a disagreement is occurring inside my head. And that's how I think about argument. I think about what are all the arguments that might come back? What questions should I be prepared to answer if I'm making this point? So, for example, I'm talking to you about chapter 4 right now. I better be able to answer every question you have about chapter 4, right? And I should be able to do that. If I am making a speech or making an argument, let's say, about something, I should be able to understand what the rebuttal arguments are. That is the best way for me to be persuasive, okay? So for me, this idea of the argument, the argumentative environment, the context of a disagreement, the context of a disagreement is not necessarily in terms of there's two people who are debating or disagreeing. It's sometimes just understanding that there is another side to your point. And you might think, well, we always know that. But how often do we truly think about it? When we are delivering a speech in class or when we are engaged in conversation, how often do we truly consider that there is an oppositional argument to what we're saying? And no, you don't always need to be, right? As my mother would say, I don't need your debate crap. I'm not always trying to get into an argument. Not always. I don't want to have a debate about everything. Sometimes I am just asking what the reasoning behind a claim or an idea is, and that's it. So your book breaks down further what is involved in an argument. So one of the things that's involved is support. Okay, what do we mean by support in this context? What we mean is anything external to you, to a conversation, to an argument, to you as a person, to them as a person, your audience as a person, anything external to that would help your claim make more sense, sound more reasonable, or it offers some evidence for why your claim is correct, right? I mean, that's not that hard, I guess, but I do want people to understand what support actually is as opposed to guessing what support might be. And so that is it for definitional standards in the text, okay? I am going to offer that sometimes arguments do come in a very clear format. In other words, that they are formal, okay? I don't know why I just tried to brush hair back that doesn't exist. It's been short for a while. One would think I'm adjusted. The idea of a formal argument. What do I mean by that? An argument structure. Now, I believe that your book gets into the structure of an argument in the next chapter, unless I'm mistaken. I don't want to jump too far ahead. Yes, arguments, types, and models of argument. So we're going to get into the more formulaic format and formal forms of argument. I don't think I could have used the word form more often or more in more different ways than I just did in that last sentence. Let me rephrase. We will study the forms and models of argument in the upcoming chapters, so next week. For the purposes of this week, understanding that an argument does occur in opposition to another argument is the key. Okay? That may be a spoken argument. It may be in the context of an actual oral debate, or it just may be that your point exists in opposition to a counterpoint. That's the most simplistic way I can put it to understand what an argument actually is. Okay? It's not the entire process. It's not always about a disagreement, but there is always a counterpoint to your point. That is what's most important. Your book then goes into some things that I feel are sort of intuitive, particularly to Gen Z. If you're a member of Gen Z, these things are intuitive to you. And those are the sort of barriers, I believe is the word that the book uses, to argumentation. This is your fake news, your misinformation, your disinformation, your deep fakes, your barriers to objective argumentation. Let's see, we've got fake news, disinformation. Oh, clickbait, that's another one. Alternative facts, sponsored content, things that people pay to have put out there. It's not great evidence if somebody paid for somebody else to say, here's what the truth is. It's not super helpful. Sponsored research is particularly a problem. So research that is done to make a product look better than it actually is. So you pay someone to come up with the results that you want them to have. Okay? That actually can get dangerous, by the way. And then I do like that they've created this word photography, FAUXTOGRAPHY, photography, meaning like the fake sort of visuals that you get, the AI generated images that are inaccurate in the sense that they don't portray the reality of something. And a lot of times that's cartoonish. A lot of times we're like, well, we're just having fun with that. But it can be incredibly problematic when people believe them to be true. And smart people, incredibly smart people, can be misled by inaccurate information, misinformation, disinformation, fake news, photography, AI generated, easily. That's why we create it in the first place, isn't it? Specifically for the purpose of misleading. All right. So the question is, how do you counter that? And so this entire section on formulating an effective proposition is talking about how to sort of come to terms with making argumentation debatable. How to make your point persuasive, and if someone wants to disagree, how do you answer that? How does it become debatable? All right. So that's what your book sort of talks about in this chapter. And it ends on one of the most important concepts in argumentation. And that is the concept of stasis. Some people pronounce it stasis. Either way is okay, just to be clear. So stasis, S-T-A-S-I-S, is the last concept in chapter 4. And therefore the last concept I'm going to talk about in this particular lecture. So what is stasis? I'm sorry, I really jumped back in my notes here. What is stasis? Your book actually defines it as the place where you choose to differ from your opponent in an argument. That is a fine definition of stasis. I'm going to offer additional definitions. These are not counter to the book in any stretch of the imagination. So, where you choose to differ with the proposition of your opponent. Okay. Stasis is the space between two equally oppositional ideas. True and false, guilt and innocence, good and bad, chocolate and peanut butter. I'm just kidding. Those two go together. The idea is that when you have two oppositional things pushing against each other, you get this point of stability between those two middle fingers there, right there. That point of stability is where we have all the information that we need at the moment, and we need to make a choice as to which side is more likely to be true. It's probability. Which way is this more likely to be true? Is it more likely that they're guilty or more likely that they're innocent? Is it more likely that this is good or more likely that this is bad? Though that is the point of stasis. It's a point of stability because it comes between two equally oppositional ideas. And that's what your book is also getting at. Where you choose to move from this is no longer two equal oppositional ideas, but my idea is better. Some people would call that the beginning of rhetoric or the beginning of argument. And yes, oftentimes we have a choice about where that point of difference begins or where that point of difference exists. But other times they just naturally occur. For example, should we go into war or should we not go into war? Those are naturally oppositional, right? And if you have to choose a side, you look at arguments for both sides, and perhaps they're equal. Perhaps the choice of what's most likely to be true isn't obvious. Where you choose to make that difference, that choice between the two, is where argumentation actually begins. All right. So that is one of the most important concepts that we're going to talk about in this class, is that point of stasis. Now, what's interesting about it, and this will lead us into our next chapters, is that a lot of people say, well, it's the point of disagreement. It's the point where you differ. I would argue that the most successful argumentation actually comes from finding the places where you agree and moving from there, and then choosing the places where you differ. But those two viewpoints, starting from the place where you differ, starting from a place where you agree, aren't about argumentation so much, or argument, I should say, so much as they are about how you go about doing argumentation, how you go about making a good argument. So hopefully these things, these little explanations here, hopefully they help you as you're reading. My point here is not to read the book to you or reiterate the book to you. Hopefully it's supplemental. Hopefully it says, here are some points that I really want to make sure that you get and that we clarify. Now, you have an exam coming up next week. And maybe it's too early to talk about this, but I do want to sort of talk about how you should be working with your book and these lectures to study for those exams. Your book very clearly lays out in the executive summary at the end of the chapter and throughout the chapter with various bolding and color changes in the text exactly what important concepts there are. There should be no surprises on your exam about what I ask, because all of the book is very, very good about highlighting in the text the most important and key concepts for you. And then at the end of the chapter, it actually tells you, here's what you should get out of this chapter. So hopefully those two things are clear signs to you for the exam, and nothing on the exam should be tricky or a surprise. All right, I hope that helps answer some questions. As you know, your exams are going to be multiple choice and short answer only. So open book should be relatively easy for you to do. You just need to take the time to find the answers. That's going to be it. All right, everybody, if you do have any questions, please let me know. Do note your assignment for this week. It is up as it was at the beginning. And good luck. And I will be grading the first week's papers tonight. Or first week's responses, I should say. So you'll have those grades. And I will be seeing you all shortly. Do email with questions, comments, concerns, complaints, etc. And have a good rest of the week. I will probably be in touch before the end of the week, assuming people send me some questions or need to know some information. Take care of yourselves in the meantime, and I'll talk to you very soon.